Welcome, class. Today we're going over Chapter 8, the Muscular System. So, in this chapter, we're going to be talking all about skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and how the muscle fibers work within each other. Your learning objectives are to list, locate in the body, and compare the structure and function of the three major types of muscle tissue. Discuss the microscopic structure and function of a skeletal muscle, including a sarcomere and a motor unit. Discuss how a muscle is stimulated and compare the major types of skeletal muscle contractions. List and explain the primary effects of exercise on the structure and function of skeletal muscles. List and explain the most common types of movement produced by skeletal muscles. Name and identify on a model or a diagram and give the function of major muscles of the body discussed in this chapter. I want to make a note here. I do not have any labeling for you. However, you have to know the muscles that are listed in this presentation when it comes to description of where they're located and if they move the upper extremities, the head, and whatnot. So, as an introduction, muscular tissue enables the body and its parts to move. There are three types of muscle tissue that exist in the body. Again, this is skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Movement is caused by muscle cells called fibers, muscle fibers, by shortening or contracting. Muscle movement occurs when chemical energy obtained from food is converted into mechanical energy. So the types of muscle tissue: first, skeletal; second, cardiac; and third, smooth muscle or involuntary. Remember, as a previous discussion, skeletal muscle is voluntary, cardiac muscle is for the heart, and smooth muscle is involuntary. The function of all muscle fibers specialize in contraction or shortening. So here you can see skeletal muscles. It's important to note that there are nuclei and striations in skeletal muscle. In cardiac muscle, you'll notice that cardiac muscle has nucleus, striations, and an intercalated disc. However, smooth muscles lack striation. Skeletal muscle is also called striated or voluntary muscle. Under a microscope, it reveals crosswise stripes known as striations, and contractions can be voluntarily controlled. Cardiac muscle composes the bulk of the heart, and cardiac muscle fibers are branched. They have cross striations like skeletal muscles and have these dark bands called intercalated disc. Cardiac muscle fiber interconnections allow heart to contract efficiently as a unit. And unlike skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle is involuntary. We cannot control our cardiac muscle. Smooth muscle, also called non-striated or visceral muscle, also known as involuntary muscle, it lacks cross stripes or striations when seen under a microscope. It appears smooth, found in the walls of hollow structures such as the digestive tract, blood vessels, and so on. And again, contractions are not under voluntary control. Now, muscle organs. They're mainly striated muscle fibers and connective tissue. Connective tissues form wrappers around each muscle fiber, around fascicles or groups of muscle fibers, which actually produce something called fasciculations, where they involuntarily twitch sometimes because of an imbalance of the electrolytes at that moment, and around the entire muscle. Then this is an important term. It's called fascia. Fascia surrounds muscle organs and nearby structures. It is a flexible, sticky material between muscles, bones, and the skin. Most skeletal muscles extend from one bone across a joint to another bone. The attachment to the bone that remains relatively stationary or fixed when movement at the joint occurs is called the origin. Very important to know that. The insertion is actually the point of attachment to the bone that moves when a muscle contracts, and the body is the main part of the muscle. Now, muscles attach to bone by way of tendons. Tendons are composed of a dense, fibrous connective tissue that extends from the muscle wrappers described earlier. It's in the shape of heavy cords or broad sheets, and tendons have a great strength. They do not tear or pull away from the bone easily. However, sometimes in certain traumas, a tendon can be torn or ruptured. Again, these strong cords or sheets of fibrous connective tissue that extend from the muscle organ and attach to bone by tendons. And some tendons are enclosed in a synovial-lined tubes called tendon sheaths and are lubricated by a synovial fluid. Now, the bursa is a small synovial-lined sacs that are containing a small amount of synovial fluid located between some tendons and underlying bones. The bursa can get inflamed, which is called bursitis. Here, this image actually shows the origin of a muscle where it does not move. Then you can see the tendons in that white tendon sheath. You see the muscle body. You can see the tendon again and the insertion site. So muscle fibers, the structures and the contraction of muscle fibers are seen in figure 8-3 in your book. The contractile cells are called muscle fibers. Connective tissue holds muscle fibers in parallel groupings, and fibers of the cytoskeleton form cylinders that contain thick myofilaments. Myo meaning muscle. Myofilaments. They contain myosin, and thin myofilaments containing mainly actin. So thick myofilaments contain myosin, and thin myofilaments contain mainly actin. So the basic functional unit is called a sarcomere. This is the contractile unit. Sarcomeres are separated from each other by dark bands called Z-lines. The sliding filament model explains mechanism of contraction. Contraction requires calcium and energy-rich adenosine triphosphate, ATP, molecules. You can see this explanation in figure 8.4. So here, this shows the thick myofilament that has myosin and the thin myofilament that's mostly actin. You can see where the sarcomere is. And you can see these Z lines and kind of how they go over each other to kind of contract and extend. Now, this is a figure 8-4. So a nerve impulse travels to a muscle fiber through a motor neuron, triggering an electrical impulse that travels along the muscle fiber membrane. So you can see that with the arrow coming down from that nerve impulse going in there. The second part, by these little green triangles, the impulse triggers the release of calcium ions from the endoplasmic reticulum into the cytoplasm. Then you can see down here where the little blue guys are, the calcium ions then bind to thin filaments and permit actin to react with myosin. Myosin heads form ratcheting cross bridges with actin, which pull the thin filaments toward the middle of the sarcomere, thus producing a contraction. So let's make a summary, which you'll see on the right side of this image, of the sliding filament model. This is a lot easier for students to remember. So for a sarcomere to contract, bridges must be formed between actin and myosin. Calcium is then released and ATP will be broken down for energy. So that is the simplest summary of the sliding filament model. So movement. Muscles produce movement by pulling on bones as a muscle contracts. The insertion bone is pulled closer to the origin bone. Movement occurs at the joint between the origin and the insertion. Groups of muscles usually contract to produce a single movement. The prime mover is mainly responsible for producing a given movement. Then you have a synergist muscles. These are helpers. They help the prime mover produce a given movement. And then you have antagonist muscles. And antagonists are always the opposite. So that's the opposite, the action of a prime mover in a given moment. Posture. This is a continuous low-strength muscle contraction called tonic contraction or muscle tone. Enables us to maintain body position. Only a few of a muscle's fibers shorten at one time. Produces no movement of body parts, and maintained muscle tone is called posture. Good posture favors the best body functioning, and skeletal muscle tone maintains good posture by counteracting the pull of gravity. Muscles are also responsible for heat production. Survival depends on the body's ability to maintain a constant body temperature. A fever or an elevated body temperature is often a sign of illness, whereas hypothermia is a reduced body temperature, usually through exposure to cold weather or elements. Now, contraction of muscle fibers produce most of the heat required to maintain a normal body temperature. Another function is fatigue, the reduced strength of muscle contraction caused by repeated muscle stimulation without adequate periods of rest. Repeated muscular contraction depletes cellular ATP stores and outstrips the ability of the blood supply to replenish oxygen and nutrients. Contraction in the absence of adequate oxygen produces something called lactic acid, which contributes to the muscle soreness. And this is also why if you get a massage or anything, it will break up that lactic acid and you're told to drink a lot of water to flush the lactic acid out of your body. There's also something known as an oxygen debt, used to describe the metabolic effort required to burn excess lactic acid that may accumulate during prolonged periods of exercise. Labored breathing after strenuous exercise is required to pay the debt. This increased metabolism helps restore energy and oxygen reserves to the pre-exercise levels. Now, roles of other body systems in movement. Muscle functioning depends on the functioning of many other parts of the body. Most muscles cause movements by pulling on bones across movable joints. Respiratory, circulatory, nervous, muscular, and skeletal systems play essential roles in producing normal movements. Multiple sclerosis, brain hemorrhage, and spinal cord injury are examples of how pathological conditions in the body organ systems can dramatically affect movement. So let's go in specific to our motor unit. The motor unit is a stimulation of muscle by a nerve impulse, and it's required before a muscle can shorten and produce a movement. A motor neuron is the specialized nerve that transmits an impulse to a muscle causing contraction. Now, the neuromuscular junction, very important here, is the point of contact between a nerve ending and the muscle fiber. The motor unit is a combination of the motor neuron with the muscle fibers it controls. There's an example of this in figure 8-5. So you can see here where the motor units are. You can see that neuromuscular junction. And again, the neuromuscular junction is really important because it is the junction between the motor neuron and the muscle fiber. They're very close together, but without this neuromuscular junction, the neurotransmitter acetylcholine would not be able to move across and trigger the events within the muscle fiber that stimulates the contraction process. Now, a muscle will contract only if an applied stimulus reaches a certain level of intensity. This is called the threshold stimulus. The threshold stimulus is the minimal level of stimulation required to cause a muscle fiber to contract. Now, once stimulated by a threshold stimulus, a muscle fiber will contract completely. This is a response called the all or none or the all or none law. In other words, the muscle fibers respond in all or none manner. You cannot partially move a muscle fiber. Now, different muscle fibers in a muscle are controlled by different motor units having different threshold stimulus levels. Although individual muscle fibers always respond in the all or none to a threshold stimulus, the muscle as a whole does not. Different motor units responding to different threshold stimuli permit a muscle as a whole to execute contractions of graded force. We have twitch and tectonic contractions. A twitch contraction is a quick, jerky response to a single stimulus. They are a laboratory phenomenon and not normal muscle activity. They are a single contraction of muscle fibers caused by a single threshold stimulus. So it causes a twitch in the muscle. If the little muscle group continues to move, oftentimes you'll hear this term called fasciculations. Now, tectonic contractions are sustained muscular contractions caused by stimuli hitting a muscle in a rapid succession, and it causes tetany, which is like a big muscle spasm. It will completely deform the hand, the arm, the leg, whatever muscles are being constantly bombarded by this rapid succession of contraction. Then we have something called isotonic contraction. This produces movement at a joint because the muscle changes length. Concentric contraction is where the muscle shortens at the insertion end of the muscle to move toward the point of origin. Eccentric contraction is when the muscle lengthens under tension, thus moving the insertion away from origin. Most types of body movements, such as walking, running, and so on, are produced by isotonic contractions. Now, isometric contraction. These are contractions that do not produce movement. The muscle as a whole does not shorten. Although no movement occurs, tension within the muscle increases. So for this, I want you to sit up straight, and I want you to not move, but I want you to kind of pull your abdominal muscles in and then relax them. You're not actually moving, but you are pulling them in, so you're contracting the muscles without moving them. This is called isometric contraction, and you can do these with the majority of muscle groups within your body. So this is an example, isotonic, toned, same tension, changing length, right? That's like moving your arm up and down, bending your leg, moving around. Isometric is the same length, but you're changing the tension. So you're not changing the length, you're changing the tension only. Now, the effects of exercise on skeletal muscle. There's quite a few things that can happen here. So exercise, if regular and properly practiced, improves muscle tone and posture, results in a more efficient heart and lung functioning, and reduces fatigue. Muscles change in relation to the amount of work that they normally do. Remember how I said earlier in another video, if you don't use it, you will lose it. So prolonged inactivity causes disuse, atrophy. Exercise, on the other hand, can increase muscle size, called hypertrophy. Now, endurance training, often called aerobic training, doesn't really result in muscle hypertrophy. Instead, it's a program that increases the muscle's ability to sustain moderate exercise over a long period. Aerobic activities are running, bicycling, or other primarily isotonic movements that increase the number of blood vessels in a muscle without actually affecting the muscle's size. Strength training increases the number of myofilaments in each muscle fiber, and as a result, the total mass of the muscle increases. Strength training does not increase the number of muscle fibers. It's the myofilaments in each fiber, but it does increase the size of the muscle. Again, endurance training is exercise that increases the muscle's ability to sustain moderate exercise over a long period. It is sometimes called aerobic training. Endurance training allows more efficient delivery of oxygen and nutrients to a muscle via increased blood flow, and endurance training does not usually result in muscle hypertrophy. Movements that are produced by skeletal muscle contractions. We have angular movements such as flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction. Flexion decreases the angle. Extension increases the angle. Abduction away from the midline. Adduction is toward the midline. Circular movements are known as rotation, circumduction, supination, and pronation. Rotation is around an axis. Circumduction is move distal end of a part in a circle. Supination and pronation, hand positions that result from twisting the forearm. Supination is when the palm of the hands are up, and pronation is when you turn them and the palm of the hands are down. Then we have special movements called dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. These are ankle movements that are upward and downward feet movement. And then we have inversion and eversion, which are ankle movements. These are kind of sideways. Now, in dorsiflexion, the dorsum, or the top of the foot, is elevated with the toes pointed upwards. In plantar flexion, the bottom of the toes is directed downward, like you're pointing your toes. This gives a good example of what flexion is and extension. If you notice in extension, it shows the brachialis and biceps brachii relaxed and the triceps is contracted. When you flex, the brachialis and biceps brachii are now contracted and the triceps are relaxed. This is flexion and extension. You can see where the thigh muscles, which are called the quadriceps femoris group, is relaxed, and the hamstring group, or the underneath of the thigh, are contracted. In extension, the quads, the quadriceps femoris, is contracted, and the hamstring group is relaxed. Again, here are examples of extension, flexion, abduction, adduction. Then you've got your circular, your right and left rotation, and you've got your circumduction. You can see your supination and pronation with your hand, your dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, and then you can see the inversion where the inside of your foot is up, and then eversion where the outside of your foot is up. So now let's go talk about skeletal muscle groups. So muscles move bones, and the bones that they move are their insertion bones. Muscles of the head and neck include facial muscles such as the orbicularis oculi, orbicularis oris, and zygomaticus. Zygomaticus is a cheekbone. Orbicularis oris is around the lips. Orbicularis oculi is around the eyes. Muscles of mastication are your masseter muscle and your temporal muscle. Your sternocleidomastoid flexes your head, and your trapezius elevates shoulders and extends the head. And you can see most of these muscles on figure 8-11. The muscles of the head and neck are figure 8-12. And table 8-2 in your book has the muscle, the function, the insertion, and the origin. Again, you will not be labeling, but you have to know which muscles are in certain areas and what they move. You can see in this image on the right side in the back of the body, the calf muscle is actually the gastrocnemius. You can see the latissimus dorsi, which is right there in the middle of the back. And for spinatus, you see the trapezius, sternocleidomastoid that goes around from the back of the head to the front of the clavicle. So it's a good image for you to know where these muscles are. Now, the muscles of the head and the neck, we talked about a little bit. You've got your frontal muscle, your temporal muscle, your masseter muscle, and your sternocleidomastoid. I've already talked about your orbicularis oculi, zygomaticus major, zygomaticus minor, and orbicularis oris. So these are all muscles of the head and neck. Now let's focus in on muscles that move the upper extremities. So the muscles that move the upper extremities include the pectoralis major. This flexes the arm. Latissimus dorsi extends the arm. Deltoid abducts the arm. Biceps brachii flexes the forearm, and triceps brachii extends the forearm. Muscles of the trunk. We have abdominal muscles. We have the rectus abdominis. And the rectus abdominis is like right in the middle. That's where you get those like 6-packs, 8-packs, right? External oblique is coming from the side. Internal oblique is on the lower, down in the pelvic area. And then transversus abdominis is actually one that kind of goes, and instead of up and down, it goes from side to side. Your respiratory muscles consist of intercostal muscles. These are in between the costal cartilage or the ribs, and a lot of times we'll see what's called intercostal retractions in someone that's having a breathing issue. And then the diaphragm, which separates the thorax from the abdomen. Here's an image of those that we just talked about. Now, muscles that move the lower extremities. You have your iliopsoas, which flexes the thigh. Your gluteus maximus, which extends the thigh. The adductor muscles, which adducts the thigh. We have hamstrings, which help to flex the leg. Remember, those are on the back of the thighs. You have your semimembraniosus, semitendinosus, and biceps femoris that make up the hamstring group. The quadriceps femoris on the front of the thigh help to extend the lower leg. This is made up of the rectus femoris and the vastus muscles. Now the tibialis anterior muscle dorsiflexes the foot, which that makes your toes point to the sky. The gastrocnemius is your calf muscle, and it helps your plantar flex your foot. And the peroneus group flexes the foot. Now, I'm sure most of you are dreading having to memorize these muscles and what they do, where they're located, but with all the studying and dedicating time to go over them repeatedly, you can get through this. So good luck in your studies, and I will speak with you on the next video.